The agenda this week discussed the role of doubt in scientific progress. We considered the qualities that make a leader in 2015 and lamented the loss of youth as one faces one's 61st year. That's Ian Brown, incidentally. The agenda's Week in Review begins with farming for a changing market. When you saw the way chickens were treated in cages, unable to move, dying, pecked away at by the other chickens, at the dead chickens, the way that pigs are inseminated artificially. I mean, you saw, for a city girl, you saw a lot of what must have been very scary stuff. I want to know how you reacted when you watched what you watched.
I had mixed reactions. Going into the farms, I should mention, to factory farms is a very sensory experience. The smell itself is overwhelming. The ammonia from all the manure that's accumulated can really get to you. So my eyes would start tearing, my throat would get itchy, I'm coughing, I'm sneezing, and it's a very strong and negative physical reaction. And that's not even the intellectual or the emotional side of it, just the physical. These places are very unethical because animals that are fully sentient, I mean, pigs are as intelligent as dogs, if not more. They're being treated just like objects where their welfare is completely being disregarded. So I found that unfair, and I was sort of unhappy on behalf of the animals who are being treated like prisoners even though they've committed no crimes. So it was a very much of a whole and complete reaction that led me to decide to make change.
Now, you know, you're in there as their guest, obviously. So
Yes.
Are you actually at any point able to say to the people who own or run these farms, what you're doing is unethical and disgusting?
It was interesting because sometimes they knew it. They did not want to go into their own factory farms. So I would have to sometimes sort of urge them to go in with me. One of the people I met is a chicken factory farmer who has asthma. Now, if he goes inside, he can actually die because the air is that bad for him. So they did, to quite an extent, know that it's unethical or it's unhealthy or there's a lot wrong with it. So it was sort of evident in the background.
Evident in the background, but is there ever a moment where you confront somebody and say, what you're doing is wrong? Did you ever have a moment like that?
I don't think I did, because it would prevent me from learning more and finding solutions. So I had to be a bit diplomatic about that.
If city types, you know, in downtown Toronto or downtown Ottawa want to pay more for their food because they think it's organic or local or, you know, makes them feel better or whatever, got a problem with that?
It's a difficult subject because, first of all, food is a very personal thing for people. It's, it's part of their culture, part of the way they define themselves, part of what they do with their spare time, the care they take of their families, and so on. So I think we have to respect that. And it creates a lot of opportunities for farmers, food companies, retailers, et cetera, and that's terrific. What we worry about, though, is where some of these beliefs are misconceived or have just simply incorrect ideas about, for example, the sustainability traits of what's being contemplated.
Let's do it, for instance.
Antibiotics. Antibiotics are a great example. Pesticides are another one. So let's use pesticides, for example.
Sure.
Pesticides are something that farmers have in their toolbox to combat whether it's insect infestations or weed infestations. Okay? As the weed population goes up, the yield of the crop goes down. The only way we can replace that, if we if we take that technology out, is to bring more land into production. And I think the scientific literature is quite unambiguous that that's the most unsustainable thing that we can do. We take away wildlife habitat, we take away wetlands and so forth to bring in agricultural production. So what we try to do is we try to get as much yield we can out of a particular footprint in agriculture. Now, of course, we can't destroy the land base in doing so. We have to make sure we have appropriate technologies and that they're used appropriately. But as we back away from those, that's the logical outcome of this, and that's a very bad outcome.
Let me just make sure I get this, Andrew. So, for example, if in an effort to buy pesticide-free whatever, or hormone-free beef or whatever, if the end result of that is having more land go into production, the bigger picture suggests that's actually environmentally less sustainable. Is that what you're saying?
Well, certainly, you know, we look around our area, you know, we've got a few spots around our farm that we don't, you know, we don't harvest anything off of. It's kind of, you know, wooded areas around creeks, things like that. If all of a sudden, you know, we're in a position that either the price of those products, because of the supply and demand, the price goes through the roof, or we get to a position where, you know, we need more acres to kind of sustain the farm, then we start looking at those, well, here's an acre that really is just for the deer and trees. You know, does it need to be part of the equation? And I know when, you know, crop prices last had their big spike, we saw in the US, in conservation reserve programs, all of a sudden go into production of agriculture that were really just kind of wildlife habitat before.
So the alternative to that is what?
Well, the alternative to that is taking a look at the technologies that are available to us. As you know, Al mentioned, we've got you know, pesticides for things like, you know, a soybean aphid, a little bug you have to look to find, and you've got to find 200 of them on a plant before you want to spray it. But when it gets over that, it actually could have a serious implication on that crop, destroying it. So then it comes down to, you know, for us, we need that crop to be able to keep the farm sustainable. So, you know, we have to spray it. So it's one of those things that, you know, we cannot, and certainly in the organic, you know, we talk about, you know, most people assume it's pesticide free. Well, it's just a different kind of pesticide. It's a natural pesticide that isn't, you know, necessarily, you know, created out of a lab or out of a chemical process, but grown, still goes through a plant and then is sprayed. So, you know, it really comes down to kind of that, it does come down to consumer preference, but at the same time, you know, there has to be that idea that, okay, just because I can afford the food, does that mean we want to make it expensive for everybody else who can't?
If you ask somebody who's 25 or 30, what would you be like when you're 60? Like, describe yourself at 60. And they describe a being who's out of, like, Isaac Asimov. I mean, like, just a complete alien. Somebody who's, you know, another being, in other words, like, not themselves. And that being, you know, I mean, I became obsessed with physical decay at one point, and I started reading about physical decay. And once you start reading, you know, your brain expands to about 28, gets more complex till about the age of 28. And at 28, it says, okay, that's enough. We're going backwards now. And it starts to go backwards. Your skin starts to decay at 35. By 39, your bones are, you know, riddled with doubt and you know, possible weakness.
Stop making it sound so wonderful, okay? Well, actually, here's a quote. Can I read a quote from the book here? A 20-year-old thinking of him or herself as an old person is imagining another being entirely, someone they are not. But they are also that person. That doubleness is how age manages to grab us by surprise. As I get older, you write, my body, this old pal I have relied on for so long, is less capable of acting in the outside world. And so the real world, the truer world, becomes the world inside me. It's a pretty profound change. So much to unpack here, but let's start with this. One of the things I found kind of incongruous about this book is I've known you, whatever, 20, 25 years. Yeah. And the you I think of when I think of you is a younger, kind of studly, very virile, flirtatious. I mean, you know who I'm talking about here, right? This is, and certainly was, you to a great extent. I don't think, I'm trying to see now. Have you got the hearing aids in?
I do, yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
I don't think of a guy, and you go on at length in this in the book, as the guy who now needs to wear hearing aids.
Right.
Do you have trouble recognizing yourself at 60?
Yes, and I'm in constant denial of the fact that I am 60. I was walking just the other day on the street and noticed a guy who had silver hair and a bit more of a pot belly than I have, and I thought, oh, look at that poor guy. You know, he's 10 years closer to the end than I am. Now, you know, that's great. And then I looked again and I realized he was 40 years old. You know, so I'm constantly denying that, you know, that inner person I was talking about, that older person is there, even now that I'm getting older. And, you know, I think you have to do that for evolutionary reasons. You don't want to admit that, and you do feel I mean, half the time I feel 25, and I'm talking to my 25-year-old friends at work, and then I realize I'm 35, is that right? Yeah, 35 years.
Beyond that.
Or I'm 35 years beyond that. And how can we be talking as equals? And that's the problem, is breaking through to not comparing yourself to others, not allowing the commercial pressure, to always think that you're supposed to be younger, you're supposed to be older. The difficulty is getting to who you actually are.
Can I ask you about a friend of yours?
Sure.
How's George?
George is okay. George is now, he's not retired, but he's resting.
Want to explain who George is?
Yeah, I know this could be the biggest single mistake I've ever made in my life. George was one of the physical changes was George is a hemorrhoid.
You named your hemorrhoid.
Well, I felt it was the only possible thing I could do. Yeah, no,
And George is still with us.
Well, George is never going away. Oh. This is the thing. George never leaves. All the Georges never leave, or the Georginas. They never leave either.
Now, the fact that you just said this may be the biggest mistake I ever make suggests that even you think maybe you've been too self-revealing on this one. Yeah?
Yeah. A little, it's not a confession, it's a candor. And a little candor goes a long way.
How about a little discretion? How far does that go?
I admit, but it's a diary, so I have to put something on the line, and I have to have something at stake, and I'm afraid George was one of them.
All right, for those who do think 60 is the new 50, what do you say to them?
I think it's entirely individualistic.
Does it feel that way for you?
Some days, absolutely. Some days it, when I walked into the bathroom at the work, went into the stall, secured the door, and proceeded to unbutton my shirt, it did not feel like, I was 50, because I wasn't doing that at 50. But at the same time, at 50, I was much more concerned with what I was supposed to think and what others wanted me to think and what I thought I should think, as opposed to what I actually found interesting. I do think freedom can come with age if you allow yourself.
Have you talked to your Globe and Mail pal Peggy Wente about this?
Yes.
She did do a piece the other day on it, and I want to read a little excerpt and get you to react to that. Because she says, don't call me a senior. I had always thought that turning 65 would be a sort of reverse Cinderella moment, when youth and love and work would all be snatched away and I would turn into a miserable, wizened crone. Instead, there was a sort of liberation. For the first time in my life, I felt that I could, within reason, do exactly what I wanted. And what I wanted was pretty much what I already had, except for the youth part. Work, love, friends, good books to read, and woods to walk in. Not much changed, except in good ways. She sounds like she's enjoying her 60s way more than you are. Is that true?
No, I'm not enjoying my 60s. I mean, look, there's two kinds of reactions to this book. One is, great, I'm glad, one can find some liberation. The other is, what the hell are you doing talking about that? It's an extension of the George argument or of Peggy's argument, which is, I only want you to see the good side. Because there is something that happens in the aging brain. Because your brain starts compensating, at a younger age, it can do one thing with one part of the brain. Later on, it needs two or three parts. The compensating brain seems to become more optimistic. It only sees the positive side of things. There's a lot of this, I don't want to be talking about this, I'd rather be in denial of it. Let's only see the good side. I'm sorry, there are great things about it, and there are dark things about it.
Okay, I'm sitting across from you. We have to go there. We're going to go there, and that is, you were the VP of English Services at CBC. Time when Jian Ghomeshi,
right,
former host of Q Now, we all know the story, was there. I have questioned what you knew, when you knew it. Why I have questioned that. We all have internally. There have been questions on the outside. I don't. You've answered the question about what you knew when. But what do you say to people who would say to you, Kirsten, there you were at the helm. Here you are, book, all about women's leadership and what needs to change. How'd you not know? What would you do differently?
I think that's a great question, because I think I refer to it in the book too as a really tough time. It was as I was writing the book that news came out, that story came out. And although it still hasn't been resolved, it raises all kinds of challenges to my own thought process around why didn't I hear? And I also understand, because unfortunately in my own ways, I've experienced the life of a woman who has been too afraid to come forward. Particularly in the media business. It's not just in television, unfortunately, or radio. It's in news. It's a whole bunch of businesses which are incredibly transient. There's this feeling that you're lucky to have the job you have, and so you don't step forward. So in as much as I would hope that someone like myself, and there were a number of female leaders across the company, that there would be a sense of openness, come to us, come talk to us. And there were other challenges, and there's been challenges in my entire career which I've had to help people through. To not know about this one was devastating, and I think reminds me of how difficult it is for people to come forward, because even when seeing someone like myself there, they didn't feel like they could. And I think that's incredibly sad, but it is a reminder that how difficult it is today for people to come forward, and how good it is now that there are actually opportunities for them to come forward, because things like technology and the kinds of platforms that even I work on today actually lend individuals a voice that they never had, so they can actually start to come forward, which is incredibly interesting.
In the last year, not just at the CBC, but in the conversation that we're having?
Well, I think just look at what's happening in terms of the I know it's selfish to kind of bring it back to the platforms that I work on, but it's something that I see on a daily basis. The kind of news that gets broken, and the way that individuals can tell their story without having to go through a multi-step process and a myriad of either press releases or people that get in the way of truth coming out. And so to be at a place that lends people that voice is incredibly, satisfying to me. I see it on a daily basis, and if that in any way those kind of movements can help people, get more truth and get more justice, I think that's a good thing, right? Like this is the hope for the future, is that technology in whatever form can give people a stronger voice and to be heard. I don't think this was the case even 5 years ago.
So this book is all about addiction, and it approaches it somewhat differently from the normal ways we're used to talking about addiction. So let's really start at the beginning. How do you define addiction?
Okay, so the subtitle of the book, The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease, and that's the theme. Although I use stories of people's addictions in quite a lot of detail to tell the human story, but I also tell the neuroscientific story. And the basic message, the disease model is very prominent, and it comes from doctors and psychiatrists and scientists at NIH, which funds 90% of the addiction research in the world.
National Institute of Health.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you don't bite the hand that feeds you in the funding world. So people keep looking at cellular mechanisms and saying, okay, well, this is wrong and this is different. And actually what's happening is the brain is changing in addiction. And it changes a lot in addiction, but it changes a lot when you learn anything that is profound and intensely motivating. The brain changes when you get married, or when you fall in love, or when you have kids, or when you become a religious fanatic, or when you become a sports fan, because the brain is supposed to change.
Okay, there's so much that you've just said in that 1 minute there, Mark. So let's break down. We'll talk about how the brain changes with addiction. But okay, if addiction is not a disease, what is it?
What is it? That's the question. It's a learning phenomenon. It's an intense, deep habit which is developed like any other habit through learning. I mean, that's how we develop our habits. And some habits become deeply ingrained. Often habits of relationship become deeply ingrained. So when we fall in love and we have a partner, and those habits they're there for a long time, even for life, even after, if you've had a separation, they're still there. In addiction, the habits have to do with seeking a particular substance or activity, and we have to recognize it's not just about drugs and booze, it's also gambling and sex addiction and porn addiction and eating disorders. Quite a few eating disorders also cross into the definition. So what you're learning is a particular way of conceptualizing what's rewarding, conceptualizing this is what I need, this is what I want, this is what I have to do, this is what makes me feel okay. And when that repeats over and over again, driven by strong emotions, because they're strong emotions, and that's partly what drives the repetition, you're building synaptic networks. As I say, that happens in learning in general.
So it's learned behavior. So
Yeah.
we accept that as a premise. That's the premise that you put forth.
Yeah.
You, in your book, talk about 3 models of addiction: disease, choice, and self-medication. So we talked a little bit about disease. Let's talk about choice and self-medication.
Often the choice model is put as the diametric opposite of the disease model. Either you have a disease and you can't help it, or you have a choice and you can help it, and it's basically your own fault. That's way too simplistic. And choice is not objective, it's not rational, it's not logical. A lot of the, I just, riding in the taxi on the way here, we made so many choices that were not logical, right?
Meaning you got lost, yes.
You got lost, and should we take this street or there's too many cars there, let's go this way, and choices like that. So the mind is not very often rational, and we often do things because of context, associations, motivation, mood. All these things affect our choices. So yes, addiction is a choice to a degree, but it's a choice that is constrained by deep learning and associations and strong emotions. So the third model, self-medication.
Yeah.
Keep going?
Keep going.
Keep going. I buy that. I think that corresponds with the learning model quite well, because self-medication means that people who've experienced often neglect or rejection or trauma or other psychological nastiness in their early years, childhood and adolescence, they come out depressed and they come out anxious. Or they have PTSD. I mean, it can be clinical or it can be subclinical, but one way or another, they're not feeling good. They're not feeling happy, they're not feeling whole, they're not feeling complete, and so they try stuff and something makes them feel better. And that's self-medication. You keep on trying it, you keep on doing it because it keeps making you feel better, and presto, you're addicted.
I can remember talking with John Polanyi about his Nobel victory and how many more people took his phone calls after he won that award than, say, before. So with a new Liberal government now in Canada, you have an opportunity, I would think, to start to influence scientific policy and political engagement in science as never before. What are you going to tell the Liberals if they reach out to you, or if you reach out to them, about what they need to do to encourage more scientific innovation in this country?
Well, I think that Canada actually has been very successful under a number of programs that were put in place starting in the 1990s. The Canada Foundation for Innovation, the Canada Research Chairs, scholarships, indirect funds to universities, a number of things that were intended to support academic research. And in fact, the results of that are such that Canada has increased its stature in the world significantly in that area. I think right now there's a difficulty in that there's been a lot of capital equipment that has been provided, which is fantastic in terms of getting things going in science, and that's part of the reason why there has been such success. Every piece of capital equipment, of course, needs to be operated eventually, and I think the agencies are just in the process of getting their acts together in terms of making sure that they are supporting appropriately projects across the country. And that's not just big science. It's the people who are getting individual grants from agencies like NSERC, for example, that are finding that operating support for such research and to really get return on investment from all of this equipment that has been purchased requires a careful examination. So I would suggest that that's something that they do. I think they could benefit from having a science advisor within their organization in the government, someone who is a very experienced person that's capable of helping them analyze the things that are being presented to them. And I think that if they did those couple of things, that'd be a real good start for a future program. Of course, it's very important that the way in which science is dealt with in this country is very open, transparent. Scientists feel as though they are able to speak their minds, and so I'm very hopeful that that's also going to be something that this new government takes very seriously.
Science is all about openness and transparency, and so I think intrinsic to science is this freedom to speak. And it's not just about freedom, it's really about critiquing one other's work. And so I think as a taxpayer, if we're going to fund, for example, government scientists, we should expect them, we should want them to share their research with their colleagues and with us.
You confident that's going to happen now?
Oh, I hope so. I mean, Mr. Trudeau has signaled indirectly that he will do that. We'll find out in the weeks and days to come.
Now, you also said money is part of the new treat as well.
Well, so money's part of it as well. And so, you know, young people, science without young people, I've also said in that address that science without young people is dead science. And at the moment, it's very difficult for young people at Canadian universities to get funding to do research. And so I worry that the best young people are going to choose careers elsewhere. And
As
so,
in not in science or not in Canada?
As in not in science or not in Canada, exactly. And so I think we have having built up over the last 10 to 20 years, a very strong kind of infrastructure for doing science. We risk literally throwing the baby out with the bathwater by not encouraging young people to do science, giving them the oxygen to breathe to do science.
Here's another excerpt from your talk. It is also a time when science is misunderstood and distrusted. From climate change to the safety of vaccines, fluoridation of water, genetically modified foods, evolution, and on and on. Well, let's take one of your examples. Your premise that doubt is essential. Should we not doubt the safety, for example, of genetically modified foods?
So it's about evidence. And so in the case of genetically modified foods or vaccines or any of the other examples that you read from my talk, Steve, there is a lot of evidence that GMOs, for example, are safe.
Genetically modified organisms.
Genetically modified organisms. And indeed, if you think about agriculture over the last 1,000 years, agriculture is a history of domestication of wild animals and wild crops. And what farmers have been doing for hundreds of years is breeding these animals and crops so that they could be domesticated and farmed. With GMOs, with genetically modified organisms, what we're doing is actually much more precise and much less intrusive, which is just inserting one gene at a time, as opposed to breeding where you don't know which genes are going to be scrambled where. And there's been lots of tests. I think the mistake in the case of GMOs that was made, unfortunately, was that the manufacturers, the companies like Monsanto, insisted that the products not be labeled as genetically modified organisms.
Which started a whole debate about are they being secret and blah,
Exactly.
blah, blah.
When you want to hide something, it implies you have something to hide. I would have actually done exactly the opposite. I would have said, it's an opportunity for classrooms to come to the grocery store and learn from a scientist from Monsanto, what did they actually do, and why is that tomato that's been genetically modified better than one that hasn't been? And so I think that was a PR mistake of the first order.
And that is our Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, tvo.org, on our iTunes channel, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Agenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.